Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you back to the Dynamic Decisions podcast, where we explore the strategies that drive successful decision-making in the world of business. Why? Because the best decisions come from great conversations. I'm your host, Tisha Cable, CEO of C Model Data, and today we have a municipal economic development leader navigating one of America's most fascinating growth stories. His name is Brit. He's the Director of Economic Development and Community Relations for the city of Bozeman, Montana. And for nearly 2 decades, Brit has served as the primary architect of Bozeman's transformation from a college and outdoor recreation town into a regional technology hub. He's done that while managing the infrastructure pressures and affordability challenges that come with explosive growth. Brit, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking a chance and being here with us. I can't wait to learn more about what you're doing. But for now, tell us more about you, your background, and your city.
Well, thank you, Tisha. It's such an honor to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. So thank you so much. You have a great podcast. That's an honor. So a little bit about myself. As you said, Brit Fontenot. I do serve as Economic Development Director for the city of Bozeman, Montana for the past 20 years or so. I'm originally from Lafayette, Louisiana, however, and it was due to a wonderful novel that I read when I was in college titled Lonesome Dove by the famous Pulitzer Prize winner Larry McMurtry that brought me out west. I drove up in my Honda Accord. They took a herd of cows, but we both ended up in roughly the same place.
That's fantastic. I love that. And you being from Lafayette, I was born and raised in New Orleans, by the way. I grew up in California
Really?
after that, but yeah, I lived in New Orleans for most of my life. Yeah.
Well, I'm a lifelong Saints fan. I hope you also enjoy watching the Saints when they're winning.
I do enjoy the Saints. It's real hard to be from New Orleans and not like the Saints. Okay. So, let's dive into something kind of fascinating about your strategy. So Bozeman didn't just attract any jobs. You have specifically cultivated photonics, quantum computing, bioscience, and the outdoor industry. So that's really a deliberate sector selection process that you've gone through. You didn't just take, people show up, so we're going to take them. So I want to understand when you're sitting down with the city council or the chamber and you're deciding which industries you're going to actively court versus which ones to let develop organically. What's the calculus? Because I imagine that there's a pressure to bring jobs. That's the whole point of economic development. But I want to know about these bets that you've made on high wage, high skill sectors.
Well, you're right. We had to make some choices. And this goes back 15 years or so now when we were looking at across our landscape here locally. And we had been a tourist town for many years, for decades. Yellowstone Park is about 90 miles from here, from Bozeman city limits. We're also a college town. As you mentioned, Montana State University, Montana's land grant university, is hosted by the city of Bozeman. And so we had to decide, where do we want to put our emphasis, because we have a small team here and only so many hours in the day. And so what we chose, our calculus was, what types of jobs are going to allow our citizens to buy into the local economy. And the reason that really resonated with me is because I went to grad school here at MSU, got a history degree. And, as a grad student, you really are challenged by your funding. There's a lot of things that go on around Bozeman that cost a good deal of money to get into: fly fishing, skiing, other outdoor activities, camping. So it's really important that, at least for me, that we work towards creating jobs that allow people to be a part of the economy, not a part from the economy. And so we focused on high growth jobs, sectors that pay high wages: the outdoor industry, photonics and optics, bioscience, manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing in particular. And we also now have evolved our sector development to include quantum computing. As you mentioned, clean technology is really an important new sector that we're working on. And as you might imagine, a lot of the technology that we're going to talk about today comes out of the university. And that's why that's a really important growth engine for not just our community, but for the state of Montana.
That's really good. And I really want to pick up on this concept that you want people to be a part and not a part. I hope that, people heard that those are some of the, when we start talking about decision making, some of the things we have to think about are the people impacts of the things that we're doing. Staying along that line, I love this podcast. We just get an opportunity to kind of talk about things at the heart of decision making when you are opting at economic growth and economic development. The Yellowstone Fiber Optic Initiative is this foundational infrastructure for a tech economy. But fiber build outs can be expensive, and the business case for a rural area isn't necessarily obvious. So here's what I'm curious about. You're championing here infrastructure with a long payback period, while taxpayers every day, they're looking at maybe like a pothole in their street every single day. So when you're making the case for fiber investment to a city council or to your team, where someone might be on the flip side, like, hey, why are we spending on internet when we have immediate infrastructure needs? How do you frame that? Because we know that infrastructure is fundamentally a longer term bet, but politics and all that stuff operate on much shorter cycles. How do you do that?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. You clearly you have your finger on the pulse of kind of what it takes to make decisions in a local government context. That project was about 15 years in the making, roughly, and we have to have the long view in our field in economic development. And my opinion is that our customers aren't necessarily even the taxpayers; they're the children of the taxpayers. The 12-year-olds, the middle schoolers. Those are the ones who we're working for and working towards building up local infrastructure. One of the things I tell my team, Tisha, is that infrastructure is economic development, and 21st century infrastructure is fiber optic connectivity. And so while there are, of course, other bits of it, roads, pipes, et cetera, fiber optic connectivity is the 21st century infrastructure that is just as important as the roads and the pipes. And so when we started this project, we had a very well-known tech company in Bozeman that was operating here, Oracle. Oracle were able to solve their own problems. This is again 15 years ago. They had enough money to pull their own fiber, and they could be successful in a community like Bozeman without ubiquitous fiber network. And so, but it became clear that not every small startup had the opportunity or the financial resources to do that kind of thing. And so we needed a better solution than that. And what we also knew was that the incumbents were not providing that solution. The cost was high, the service was poor, the customer service was even poorer. And so we knew that if we needed to do something different, but we weren't interested in just the same old model doing the same old thing. And so what we do through a partnership with the chief technology officer at Montana State University, DeWitt Latimer, we came up with a plan that was going to include a different model, an open access model. And for those that know fiber networks, open access means that the fiber optic cables are owned by the infrastructure provider, in this case, Yellowstone Fiber, but they allow the leasing of those lines to the service provider so that they can provide service to the end user. Now, why that's really important is because the more common way of providing service is for the service provider to own the customer by owning the infrastructure. And we said, well, that's part of the problem. So let's create an open access network where a community benefit nonprofit, in this case, Yellowstone Fiber, formerly Bozeman Fiber, so it's been evolving. We can talk about that, the evolution later, but we needed a model that allowed the end user, business or resident, to be able to make a decision based upon quality and service. And that wasn't happening in the market. And so our effort all those years ago was to essentially create a model that we could get local banks to buy into for a very small fiber bill, about a $4 million bill that's just connected our business corridors. And then as we trundled along, a few more years, COVID hit, and it became really clear about why internet connectivity and fiber optic connectivity was critical for almost all services. Prior to that, it was like, it's nice if you have good connectivity. Now we know it's essential that you have good quality connectivity. And so with that in mind, it became much easier to convince the elected officials that this was the right way to go. Now, I must tell you that this effort came not at the cost of the taxpayer, which is a little bit unusual perhaps, but this is not a municipally owned fiber network. We started it in Bozeman, but the ownership model is that of a community benefit nonprofit that puts all of its money that it makes back into the network that serves the community. So while it's not municipally owned, it is a community owned, if you will. And so
Yeah.
that's a really important differentiator between the work that Yellowstone Fiber does on behalf of the community and that of a private service provider.
That's awesome. And staying on the tune of innovation and also your work at MSU. So you're the chair of the Innovation Campus Board, classic town and gown alignment,
Mhm.
which we know is really difficult, really hard. So universities, they optimize for research excellence. Companies need commercializable IP really fast. And cities are like, I need jobs and a tax base. So the challenge I see is that when you're looking at university technology transfer opportunity, how do you distinguish between this will create local jobs versus this is interesting research that'll get licensed to a company in Boston, so to speak?
Sure.
Because universities, they have lots of IP, but not all of it actually turns into hometown companies. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So, that's where the Bozeman lifestyle comes into play. And for those that aren't aware, Bozeman is located in southwest Montana, about 90 miles from Yellowstone Park, just surrounded by several mountain ranges in a beautiful valley. If you're into mountains, it's where people want to live. It's access to skiing. It's access to other outdoor activities that people tend to enjoy. So you're right on in terms of like, how is the university benefiting the community? And I would say in a couple ways. And we do have a very outstanding tech transfer office that helps us move intellectual property from the lab or the classroom into the market. And so the way it works would be that tech transfer office would support the IP transferring out of the university through licensure or some other mechanism. And luckily for us, the professors or the students that created that value, more often than not, certainly not always, but more often than not, they actually want to stay. They
Mm,
want to be here for the reasons I just described. And so that allows me and others the opportunity to come up with ways of supporting them through business development activities and perhaps most importantly, a talent pipeline. And that talent
mm,
pipeline comes from the university. And so we are the STEM college. I mentioned we're also the land grant university. That's really important as well because they are looking to attract the best and the brightest students from across the state of Montana in order to educate them and go out and change the world, I think, in some really positive ways. So Montana State attracts the talent, it educates the talent, and then hopefully through the tech transfer opportunity, that talent can stay here in town where they want to be and raise their families and have great careers with a lifestyle that supports their what they love to do.
it's great. And you bring up one of the more important parts of economic growth, which is the pipeline. So the talent pipeline is mission critical. So you guys have a way of managing that, which is great. So I have a little bit of a tough area, but it's not controversial, trust me, because I don't do too much of that. But it's a tougher area because it's a little bit of stuff. So you oversee affordable housing programs while you're recruiting companies, right? This is just so the it's a boomtown paradox and it's happening in multiple other areas. So you're successfully attracting these high wage jobs, but housing costs are making it impossible for people like teachers, service workers, and like mid-level professionals to afford living in these places. So when you're thinking about recruiting another tech company, bring another 100 high paying jobs, how do you factor in the housing pressure that this creates? And have you had any moments where it might be an economically smart move that to land this employer, but it conflicts with the community reality that you're pricing out people who might make the city function?
Yeah. Well, so that is the challenge of our time, what you just described. And yes, there is a tension between those things. So a couple things, if I could just sort of establish sort of a baseline. The city of Bozeman does not recruit companies. We don't have a recruiting strategy. We don't recruit from the outside. We practice a strategy rooted in that economic gardening philosophy where we want to grow from within. We want to grow our own because we feel like those are the companies that really, through challenging times, make decisions to stay, as opposed to pulling up stakes and maybe move into another community that might have other incentives to offer. So just to be clear, we don't offer incentives. We don't offer tax breaks. You know, and I know there is a whole school of thought in economic development, perhaps a little bit of a dated school of thought about incentives. And I know there's certainly some states that really use incentives to their advantage. And we probably can think of one that comes to mind first is Texas. But there are others. Montana does not have a value set that includes those types of incentives. Our value proposition is our people. That talent pipeline that I referred to earlier at MSU, that gets a lot of people's attention because if I can show how a company can hire and retain employees, that can have a financial benefit that really comes close to any tax break that they may receive. And it also produces a loyalty that you can't put a price tag on. And I think that's how we create, and we're not always successful, but it's been a pretty successful formula over the years. And that's how we create companies with staying power that are choosing to come here and be here and weather some of the challenges of being in a more rural state, of not having access to all of the massive transportation networks that perhaps the East Coast might have or the West Coast. But we have some other benefits though. What I mean by that is we're a big state with a small number of people. So we also have access, and that's really important. I have access to the mayor. I have access to my state legislators. I have access to the governor. I have access to my congressional delegation. So that access gives me and others an opportunity to really communicate with the decision makers, and that's proven to be quite an effective strategy. So just back to your primary question, I just want to kind of lay the
That was
groundwork a little bit.
good.
Back to your
Yeah.
primary question, we feel like with that strategy in mind, if we can using our tech transfer office, we can create companies that are essentially grown from within. And that growing from within strategy is what keeps us, I think, competitive with other parts of the country, and more so all the time. And I'll just give you one other quick example. Montana State University's profile is beginning to rise. And for years and decades, East Coast universities, West Coast universities, well-known, very fine universities. Don't get me wrong. It's not a criticism. I'm just pointing out these are where oftentimes industry would go for cutting edge research, cutting edge researchers. Well, that's changing. And Montana State University is attracting cutting edge researchers. They are now doing the cutting edge research. They now have the mass spectrometers and millions of dollars worth of equipment that are used not only by researchers, but by industry. And our waiting list is a lot shorter than it is in other parts of the country. So we are now attracting very large international companies, national companies that are now aware that they don't have to wait 6 months to use the piece of equipment on either coast. They can come to MSU, and in a week and a half, they can be running their experiment. And that's a value proposition to industry because time is money. And so that is starting to really take hold. And again, our profile is being elevated by one other large development, which is the selection of Montana as one of the tech hubs. So if the CHIPS Act provided for funding for tech hubs across the country, our specialty in Montana, particularly at Montana State, are sensors. And so sensors and optics and photonics, and now quantum. But that designation, it is a statewide designation, to be clear. So the University of Montana has a role to play. Montana Tech has a role to play. And Montana State has a large role to play. Others may not, but I consider us sort of the center of that tech hub. And so now is a very important time for all this convergence to occur.
I like it. My big takeaway is called economic gardening. So for the audience, economic gardening was my big takeaway from that. Thank you so much for explaining that in detail. So I do have a quick audience thing. Hey, if I want to know what you've seen in your community that has changed dramatically through growth, what was gained and what was lost, we'd love for you to share some of your opinions with us on the Dynamic Decisions podcast. Do it on social media. We look forward to it. So listen, there's something very fascinating about your background. You have 5 years at the UN Compensation Commission in Geneva processing international environmental damage claims. So that is completely different from Montana municipal development. So, but you brought something from that experience into this work. So can you tell me, what did navigating multicultural, high stakes international governance teach you about building consensus that a traditional economic development who may have come up through local government would never think about, because that Geneva experience, it must shape how you operate right now.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that experience at the UN changed my life. Just period. Being in that setting, doing that work, and just to be clear, I'm not a lawyer, but but my role was as a support for the teams of lawyers that were working on these international claims. And so, what it really did was it gave me a new appreciation for the complexity of ideas that come from a variety of different people and cultures and backgrounds. Just a quick example. As I was learning about this, some of the work included putting values on a variety of different pieces of cultural pieces that have cultural significance to some of these places. Like, for example, the Saudi Arabian desert or the Kuwaiti desert. They were putting valuations on square meters of desert, and I, as an American who's not familiar with that part, that sort of landscape, I didn't quite understand initially, like why that mattered. But with after sort of better understanding, a little bit more research, a little bit more since cultural sensitivity, it became clear to me that I looked at that piece of ground very differently than someone who was from that culture looked at that piece of ground. And it became clear to me, at that moment, like how important it is to really try to understand where other people are coming from, and that my frame of reference may not be the only frame of reference. And so it's important to understand, to listen for understanding before you start telling people how it's supposed to go. So I've taken that to heart, and it's really changed my life. As I said, I no longer see myself as a person who has all the answers, or not that I ever did necessarily, but like I'm not always coming with the answer. I'm coming with a lot of questions. More than that, just to understand where you might be coming from, and with that dialogue, I might have some ideas. But it's not coming from a place of I have all the answers. And I learned that working at the UN, because a lot of people with a lot of different backgrounds saw things quite differently.
It's the complexity of doing anything. So I think that would serve you well in any situation, because I always say people gonna people, right?
Yeah,
So
and
you
people
have
are
to,
complex, right? We
and
are complex beings, and
we
we
are
have
complex.
we have to remember that.
We do. So good stuff. Listen for understanding. Okay, now we're going to come to my favorite part of my whole podcast, which
All right.
is we're going to dig into your decision-making DNA.
Okay.
Okay. So I got 4 different styles, and I'm going to see which ones actually resonate with you. So after I give you a statement on each one, you're going to give me a number from 0 to 100% to tell me how much it resonates with you, what I'm saying, and a little bit about why that is. You would tell me. But the thing is, you only get 100% total.
Okay.
The first one is the feeler. It's a values driven leader. This is the leader who asks, beyond the economic metrics, what does this do to the actual people and the character of this place? Here's the scenario. A tech company wants to locate to Bozeman. Great job, significant tax revenue. But as you dig in, you realize it'll accelerate housing pressure, price out more teachers and firefighters, and create development patterns that fundamentally change neighborhood character. The economic case is clear, but the community cost is real. That tension between growth that looks good on paper and growth that serves people already here, when you're managing affordable housing programs alongside economic development, how much does that values-based calculation drive your recommendations? 0 to 100%.
I was really thinking hard about that. That's why I was quiet, because I was thinking, because that is my everyday. That is what you just described. That's part of my everyday everyday work. Trying to juggle those different areas. I would say what you just described is really important from the policy side of things, where our local elected officials are really clued into those types of issues, because their constituents are the ones who call when the building is going up, or what have you. So I would say that I don't lead with that. I would say that's maybe 25%.
Okay. 25% feeler. All right. The next one is called the planner. It's a strategic visionary. So this persona thinks about compounding effects across multiple futures. So here's what I mean. Remote work might make Bozeman's outdoor recreation access a sustained advantage, or it might attract growth that overwhelms those amenities. Climate change might intensify wildfire seasons and water scarcity. MSU might commercialize breakthrough tech that you capture, or companies might take the IP and scale elsewhere. So when you're deciding which sectors to cultivate or which infrastructure to prioritize, how much are you gaining out of these different scenarios and building optionality versus optimizing for the present moment?
Wow, that's another really good question, and one that I also think about quite often. I mean, there are always going to be tensions in the work that we do. There's tension between the regulator and the advocate, and I think about that myself as an economic developer, as an advocate, and my colleagues in community development as the regulators, and there's tension there. But I think it's good tension, it's healthy tension, and it helps me remember that there are other viewpoints and perspectives that are valid and should be considered. And so with that in mind, I would say, however, planning is a critical to my work because economic development is the long game, and if you need a plan. If you're going to have if you're looking 25 years out, you better have a plan to help guide you. And of course, the longer you get from the day you ink your plan, the less valid your plan is, right? The less certain you're going to be on that same path. And so I do believe in planning. I have an economic vitality strategy that's about a 5-year plan, 3 to 5 years, depending how fast things change. And we follow that plan. I have an implementation matrix that holds me accountable for what I've been able to implement based on that plan. And we know from the get, we're not going to be able to do everything. We have a small team here, but it helps us prioritize. It helps us understand other viewpoints. And so just to kind of sum up, I do think planning is a big part of what we do. So I would say that was, if I were going to give it a percentage, I would say that's probably worth about 40%.
25% feeler, 40% planner. You ready? Let's keep it moving. This
Okay.
one is called the counter. It's the challenger of assumptions. So this is the person who questions whether the conventional economic development playbook is even right. Here's the contrarian take. Most cities compete on tax incentives, race to recruit the largest employers, measure success in jobs and capital investment. Bozeman got what everyone says they want: explosive growth, tech sector, population influx. But that growth created housing crisis, infrastructure strain, and character concerns. How much do you find yourself questioning whether more growth is always better? Is actually true? What if Bozeman's advantage comes from being more selective, from saying no to certain growth to protect capacity for the right opportunities? Given that you've seen both benefits and costs of rapid expansion, what assumptions about how cities compete could you challenge? So how much challenger is in your approach?
That's a fair question. I'm not a very, I'm kind of conflict averse, so I try not to like get in people's faces like that. But I do challenge assumptions, but I don't count. Like I don't keep score in the way some people might keep score. Like for example, we have a community that is a lovely community in our state, Missoula, Montana. They host the University of Montana. We're the sort of the university towns, and there's kind of a running, I don't know, not game, but like a challenge between the two communities. Which one is better? Which one's Bozeman better? Is Missoula better? Is Butte better? Is Helena better? I think there's a lot of that gets a lot of clickbait surrounding who's got the better town, cooler town, the hipper town. I mean, whatever the metric is. But honestly, I don't spend a lot of time looking over my shoulder at my communities around the state, because I don't believe that when we do well, others have to do poorly. I don't
Come on.
believe it's a zero-sum game. We have a community just outside of Bozeman called Belgrade, Montana. That's the fastest growing. They're a smaller town. They're about 9,000, I believe now. They're the fastest growing city in the state of Montana. When Belgrade does well, Bozeman does well. And when we do well, so do they. I prefer to think of it as not living in the shadow of, but basking in the glow of. And I think it's a mindset. Are you thinking about abundance? Or are you thinking about scarcity? And to me, if one has an abundance mindset, growing the pie is our goal here. And so if we can grow the Montana pie, then everybody can benefit from that effort. And so with that in mind, I don't really, I don't keep track of it the same way some other people may.
That's good. A rising tide floats all boats. So what you got? What's your percentage?
Let's see, that must be, since I don't think about it very much, I'd say maybe 15%.
Okay, 15%. All right, so 25% feeler, 40% planner, 15% counter, and that leaves us with the very last one. You ready?
I'm ready.
It's called the data driver. It's an evidence-based decision maker. So this leader wants quantitative validation, fiscal impact analysis, job creation metrics, ROI on infrastructure. Here's the paradox. You can measure jobs created and tax base expansion, but how do you quantify whether Bozeman's quality of life remains intact, whether community cohesion is strengthening or eroding, whether existing residents have pathways to prosperity or are they being displaced? So when you're making TIF decisions or infrastructure investments, how much do you rely on hard data versus qualitative signals from longtime residents and newcomers about whether growth is genuinely serving the community? So give me a number. How does this data driver work for you?
So I think I only have 20% left if my math is right. Just knowing that, I will say it's really important. It's more than really important. It's critically important. I'll just give you one quick example, in the housing space. So we do a report every year, a market update every December, and we release it to the public. We have a little event and we show a lot of data, a lot of metrics. And so one of the metrics that we showed back in December of this past year, 25, was vacancy rates. Okay. And vacancy rates were really high at the time because my team and the community had put about 1,000 units on the ground over the previous 3 or so years when we were in what we called here a housing crisis. So we really got after it using every tool available to us to deliver over 1,000 rental units in the course of a couple of years. So as you guys can imagine, the minute the building's complete and you get your C of O, the place is not full. It's empty, in fact. And so your vacancy rates are really high. So one has to allow that filtering to occur in order to get a real sense of what the vacancy rates are once you have a bunch of a new stock that's available. And so people were using that vacancy rate as a 44%, I believe is what it was, as a way to, sort of discourage continued housing work because, heck, if you have a 44% vacancy rate, you don't need housing, clearly. But,
Right.
but that's a little bit disingenuous because that's a moment in time that doesn't account for what occurs basically after that, which is happening now. And so now vacancy rates are down, extraordinarily from that big number as we assume they would be, because that's why data is really important. My commissioners want data. Those that do our third party tax generation work want the data, and we need the data if we're going to be effective because the community expects us to have real information that is actionable. And so we put that at a premium and we work hard to provide data to our elected officials for their policy discussions, to us for decision-making and recommendations, and to the wider community so that they can see where this is coming from. So I wish I could change my numbers, Tisha, because if I only had 20, maybe I should adjust, but I'll go with 20 if that's what I've got left.
That's what you got left, but that's pretty good. So you got 25% feeler, and it makes sense, right? So it ideally, you have a team, and in your team or your group of people in the ecosystem that you work in, people play these different roles. That's a part of what this highlights. 40% planner. 15% counter and 20% data driver. I like it. I think this is pretty good. It's a pretty balanced approach. I've got one final question for you. So you've guided Bozeman through nearly 2 decades of transformation. What's the most important thing that other rapidly growing communities get wrong about managing growth?
Ooh, what they get wrong. Wow, that's a good another good question, Tisha. You're full of good questions today. I spent criticizing my colleagues across the country on what they're doing wrong, but I think for us, it's really just here's what I do for us. I understand what are the community values, because I think if you try to buck the community values, you're really going to find that you're going to struggle almost at every turn, moving your projects forward, moving your work forward, moving your ideas forward. So I don't know that people get it wrong as much as maybe we should just all do a little bit of extra homework to understand what are the community values. Because if you can hit the mark or close to the mark, then I feel like the work that we do will get more support from the community members, which then, of course, filters into our elected officials and makes our job more rewarding and more successful.
I love it. Shared values are it's a staple. It's one of the most important beginnings. So, Britt, this has been fantastic. You
Thank
are absolutely navigating one of the most complex challenges in this country, which is how do you grow in ways that create opportunity without destroying what made the place special? So, where can people learn more about you and more about Bozeman's approach?
Well, we have a website like most communities. www.bozeman.net is our website. I'll give you my cell phone number, 406-579-1302. Anyone can call me at any time. I do pick up my phone and I do return messages and calls. So if anyone wants to know more about Bozeman, give me a ring or just come visit and see for yourself.
Fantastic. And to our listeners, if this conversation made you think about growth in your own community, what's being gained, all of that good stuff, who's benefiting, we'd love to hear from you. We want you to subscribe, share it with someone in and outside of your community. And let's keep the conversation going on social media using Dynamic Decisions Podcast. And until next time, keep questioning, keep growing, and keep leading with purpose.